Hi, so I'm a student studying sonography, and I found it quite frustrating to do the physics aspect of sonography. I've never actually studied physics in school, and so it was very, very challenging. So what I did is I looked through lots of PowerPoint presentations, I watched lots of YouTube videos, and I read my book over and over and over again that was supplied by my college, and I came up with this video, which kind of pulled everything together for me. So I hope it helps you if you're also struggling with physics. So here we go. Okay, so before we get too deep into the presentation, we're just going to touch lightly on the different modes. And I think it's important that we keep these terms straight into in our head from the very beginning. So that's why I've put them here now. So B mode is our brightness mode. That's this one over here. And that is what most ultrasound sonographers are going to be using 90% of the time. It provides information about structure, and it utilizes these different shades of grey in a two-dimensional image. Our color Doppler, which is seen in the middle, is basically B mode running in the background. And then what it does is it superimposes this color on the top of B mode. So it's able to show us blood flow or tissue motion in that selected two-dimensional area. So it tells us direction and velocity of that tissue motion and blood. And as I said, it then color codes that and it superimposes that color on top of B mode. When you look at spectral Doppler, which is the one over here on the right that I'm circling with the mouse, it has basically B mode running. Then it has a color Doppler, which we often use to know where to put our little gate. And then what we have is we have this little box, if you can see this little box here. And then we have a tiny little sample that we tell that machine, I'm only interested in this area. And that will be a bit more clear later on in a video that I've put in this presentation. But what that little reading does is it shows you velocity over a period of time in this spectral wave down the bottom. And that's the main differences between the three modes that are on the screen right now. Keep in mind there is also continuous wave Doppler and power Doppler, but I talk about those individually later. Okay, so the next question we need to really ask ourselves is, what is Doppler ultrasound? In the most basic terms, it is imaging flow. And it's based on high school physics, which is the Doppler effect. So I do really think it's important, especially for someone like me who never had a background in physics at all, not even in high school, to go over this principle. For some people it might be basic, and if it is, feel free to skip this part of the presentation. But I'm going to explain it for people like me, because that's who I made this video for. So if we have a static sound source, which is our car here on the left, it doesn't matter if we're standing in anywhere around that car, okay? The frequency of sound emitted is the same in any direction. If the source is moving, then the frequency you hear on each side of the car will be different. So if we're standing, say, at the front of the car, and the source of sound is coming towards you, it's going to be a higher pitch. And you can see that in the little waveform down here. You can see that it's a higher frequency. If the source of sound is moving away from you, so now you're standing behind the car, the frequency is going to be lower. So it's going to be a lower pitch. And that's the main basic, Doppler principle. So how does that relate to blood? It's a similar principle. So echoes, from blood moving towards the probe are going to be returning at a higher frequency, and echoes from blood moving away from the probe will be returning at a lower frequency. And that's how the machine knows whether to, make the blood blue or make the blood red. On your screen, but that can be inverted. So we will go into that as well later, but just keep that in mind.
Doppler frequency, or Doppler shift, is the change in the frequency of sound waves that occur as they are reflected off a moving object. A real-life example is how you hear a siren as an ambulance is driving towards you, and how the sound changes as the vehicle travels past and away from you. This is how the principle of color Doppler works when studying blood flow and the movement of red blood cells. To obtain the best Doppler images and detect the largest Doppler shift using ultrasound, the transducer must be placed at an angle of 0 degrees to the vessel of interest. However, due to practical considerations, an angle of 60 degrees is used. Color Doppler can distinguish when blood is flowing towards and away from the transducer. When blood is moving towards the transducer, it is termed a positive Doppler shift and is represented as a red flow of blood on screen. A negative Doppler shift, where blood cells are moving away from the transducer, is represented as blue on screen.
Okay, so I hope that makes a little bit more sense. If it's still confusing, I'm going to try and break it down into one last explanation. And I think this was the way I kind of got my head around it. So basically, picture a probe in your mind, and then that probe sends out a sound. And that sound has a frequency. When that sound hits moving tissue or moving blood in your body, the returning echo is different. And the difference between the original sound sent out by the probe and the altered returning echo of that sound as it bounced off something moving is called the Doppler shift. So the frequency change between your original frequency and that returning echo is called the Doppler shift. I hope that makes more sense. And if it doesn't, I suggest you stop here until you get your head around what Doppler shift is, and then come back to this video. Okay, so we now know that echoes from moving blood and tissues are Doppler shifted, and that meant that the frequency is slightly altered. What we need to look at now is how does that appear in different ways in Doppler. So it can appear in our one on the left, which is our color Doppler and our color overlay. And that gives us information about blood flow and direction and location. And that is seen in the intensity of color. And we have this color scale on the left, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. But we also have, our spectral Doppler, and that's when we look at this little tiny gate here. And what that does is that tells us information about the velocity of blood. We can see the waveform shape, and it gives us information about the spectral distribution. So it's telling us about blood flow and resistance as well. And then lastly, we've got an audible sound, and that audible sound gives us information that so we can hear the fetal heartbeat. We use it a lot in echocardiography, but we can listen to any vessel in the body if it's big enough. Obviously not little tiny ones, but we can listen to the portal vein, we can listen to hepatic, we can listen to aorta. There's lots of big vessels that we can listen to, and each vessel has its own distinctive spectral Doppler waveform as well. Again, recapping on what I just explained, how do we use this information? Well, we use it for location and distribution of our flowing blood, and we use it for the information about the speed of blood and how that changes over time, so that's spectral Doppler. And we use it to assess tissue motion, for example, the heart, and we use that with spectral Doppler, with color Doppler, and with our sound. So now that we've briefly touched on B mode, color Doppler and continuous wave Doppler, we're going to look at color Doppler in greater detail, and we're going to look at that side by side with power Doppler because they're quite similar. And then we're going to look at pulse wave Doppler in more detail, and we're also going to add in continuous wave Doppler. which is quite different, and it's mainly used in echocardiography. First up, we're going to look at color Doppler. Color Doppler is a type of pulse wave Doppler. And what it is it's a scanned beam. So you can see up here in the right hand corner there's a little box. This would be a curved probe, and its box is shaped like this. And what it does, coming back down to our little blue box with our little white image, you can see here that we've got a probe and it's shooting out these lines over a structure of interest. And so what it does is it shoots this line down, and it shoots this beam is pulsed 8 times, and then it moves to the next section. And then it shoots down another line 8 times, and then it moves to the next section, and it shoots down that 8 times, moves to the next section, until it builds up this whole color box that you've told the machine, I'm interested here, I want to see, you know, blood flow in this little particular box. So again, don't forget that's a B mode running in the back, and then we've got our color superimposed on top of that B mode. And the way it's doing that is to say, okay, just in that little box, I'm going to shoot out these 8 signals, and then I'm going to switch to the next step, and then the next step, and the next step. And you can see here how there's these little circles, and what that's doing is there's sample volumes. And those sample volumes are basically looking for 3 numbers. It's looking for your average Doppler shift, which we call the mean Doppler shift. It's looking for variance, which is something that I'll explain a bit later. It's looking for power, and you know, your power is the measure of strength of the Doppler signal, and it's used in the tissue blood discrimination process, but we'll talk about that more later too. Anyway, that mean Doppler shift is converted to color, and it's superimposed onto our B image, and then the machine determines where there is blood and not tissue. So that then is displayed up onto the top of our image. Power Doppler is a little bit different to color Doppler. It's still built the same way though. And what I mean by that is that those beams are shot out, and there's 8 pulses, and then it's moving to the next step, and 8 pulses moving to the next step. So it's built the same way, but power Doppler, it's not the Doppler shift that's displayed. What's displayed is the power or the strength of the Doppler signal at each point, and it determines what color will be displayed. And it's really useful because you know, the color relates to the moving blood volume more so than the direction of the blood. So we can really use this to assess vascularity in regions where there's only small blood flow. You know, there could only be a trickle of flow in a vessel. So that could also show up, you know, in really stenosed arteries that have been totally occluded as well. And we tend to use this when we're looking for renal transplant patients, or when we're looking for testicular torsions and things like that. But there is a video that will talk about that, and we'll see it in more detail as well.
Color Doppler relies on Doppler effect, or Doppler shift is what it has been, I've heard too. Essentially, if you can imagine standing on the edge of a highway and with cars speeding by, or by a train that's speeding by, and when you hear the train coming towards you, the train has a higher pitch than when it passes you, or the car does. And is what happens is that as the train travels towards you, it has a higher frequency. Essentially, the sound waves are compressed. As it moves towards you, it makes the frequency of the sound waves smaller, and so you hear a higher pitch. As it passes you, then the sound waves are stretched out, and that causes a lower frequency, and you hear that deeper pitch as it goes by. And so color Doppler relies on the same effect. Essentially, the probe is what it's doing is it's telling, it's interpreting the sound waves as they bounce back to it or bounce off structures, and the machine receives back and telling it whether the sound wave has increased or decreased in frequency. And so as what we see on the machine is we see what we call BART, and we have essentially blue away or red towards. And so if we look at the probe, we place the probe up here, we've got a scale. So if we're going away, we've got blue down here and red comes towards. So if the flow of something comes towards the probe, it's going to be red. If it goes away, it's blue. Now here, this is a little confusing. We see both blue and red going on, and that's because this is a pseudoaneurysm. Essentially, that blood is cycling round and around in this structure. So here we're over the abdomen of a patient, and we're looking at the aorta. And if you notice the angle of this probe, so we've got the probe marker towards the patient's head, and then this towards the feet, but we've angled down towards the pelvis, and that's why we get this slanted view of the aorta. Now, we have, as we notice this, so this blood flow is traveling away or traveling deep down at this angle away from the probe. So the probe sits here and it's traveling down and away. So we get the blue color flow put on there. And this is important that you remember that red and blue have nothing to do with which vessel it is. It has absolutely to do with only what the direction is in correlation to the probe. These machines are smart, but they are not smart enough to tell you what vessel. So don't ever assume that. You just know that the blood is either traveling to or away from the probe. So in this example, we're on the exact same patient, but now instead of angling towards the feet, we've angled the probe up towards the head. And so now the aorta is coming out this way and it's coming towards us. And so now we see that in correlation to where the probe's placed, this is coming at an angle towards it. And so this gives us a red color within the vessel. And like I said, this is the exact same aorta. Remember, vessels do not light up one color or the other. It depends on what direction the blood flow is coming to or away from the probe. So before we saw it in blue, now we're seeing it in red. Now power Doppler is a little bit more sensitive, is a way to think of that. It does not tell us whether it's going to or from. It's just essentially interpreting whether that sound wave has had any shift in its frequency, whether it be a higher frequency or a lower frequency. And so sometimes that's good in really low flow states. Now we're on the aorta and it's not a low flow state, but we're essentially parallel to the probe, right? So because we're parallel, we don't often get colors to show up because we can't interpret if it's coming to or away from the probe. So in this case, we aren't caring if it's coming to or away from the probe. We just wanted to see if it's color. So a lot of times on the machine, you'll hit your color Doppler button and then there will be an option to change it to power Doppler, and that's all we've done here. This becomes very useful in low flow states. I like it for using it on testicular ultrasound and gynecology ultrasound. Sometimes I'll use it around abscesses if I want to pick up flow. You can use it in GYN sometimes to pick up flow within the uterus. But it's the same principle, but it's not going to tell you whether it's coming to or away from the probe.
Okay, so comparing our colour and power Doppler just quickly side by side. Our colour Doppler will show us the flow direction of blood. So it'll tell you whether it's coming towards or away from the probe in relation to the probe. Obviously, it's important to know your anatomy and it's important that you know where to put the probe. We will go into the probe angle a little bit later, which is more concerned with colour Doppler more than power Doppler. But yep, again, side by side, it's less affected by tissue motion because it's less sensitive. And then, you know, also when you're moving your probe around, it's less affected as well because it's not as sensitive. But when we're looking at our power Doppler, it's more sensitive. Our power Doppler will not show you the Doppler shift. As I said before, it shows you the power strength of the Doppler signal. And for that reason, you know, it is more sensitive. It's angle independent, which means we're not really concerned whether the blood's coming towards or away from the probe. We're just looking for, is the blood there? And one of the advantages of that is we don't get something called aliasing, which we will look at in more detail later. So now we're going to talk about our pulse wave Doppler. Our pulse wave Doppler is quite different to our colour and power Dopplers, and the main difference is that pulse wave Doppler is a single beam. Remember, in our colour and power Doppler, we're shooting out 8 pulses, and then we're moving to the next step, and then we're moving to the next step, and we're moving to the next step. Pulse wave Doppler is not like that. It's a single beam, and it's a stationary beam. And one of the side effects is that creates an increased exposure of the patient to ultrasound. So you need to keep that in mind, because as ultrasound moves through, tissues, it distorts them, and that distortion creates heat. And so obviously, we don't want to be doing that to, say, in the first trimester with an embryo that's only a couple of days old. So you need to keep in mind, that pulse Doppler does use this single beam, and it does expose the patient to, high levels of ultrasound. But let's talk about how it works. So there's short intermittent bursts of ultrasound that are transmitted, and then what the machine does is it listens for a brief time interval, and then because we've told the machine with this little, range gate, this little sample volume that we've put in here, basically the machine will analyze information from that little area only. So it's not concerned with anything else in the image except for what's coming and what's happening in this little tiny range gate. And that's called the sample volume. So yes, it uses the same relationship between echo arrival time and depth as our grayscale imaging. So obviously it's affected by our PRF, and we'll talk about that later too. And the operator is the person that actually has to position that sample volume. So they do something else called angle correction, which is also later on in the presentation. But what those two little bits of information, the sample gate and the angle correction, do is it allows the machine to determine the blood flow direction. And it takes this little range gate and it reads it 128 times, 100 to 128, and then it creates the velocity of the blood over a period of time, and that's how we get our spectral waveform down the bottom. So this part on the side is measuring our velocity. So just keep in mind that when you're looking at pulse Doppler, we're looking at 3 modes in one. So what's happening here is this top image is our B mode, or our grayscale mode, that's running in the background. Then we usually put on color Doppler. Color Doppler kind of acts as like a guide to, where the blood is flowing in that vessel. And then on top of that, we put in our pulse wave Doppler. And that's once we hit that button, the machine is only going to display information for our spectral waveform of what's going on in that tiny little gate.
So pulse wave Doppler relies on Doppler effect, and is what it is you're in your B mode ultrasound, you hit your power Doppler or pulse wave Doppler, and you get this line that shows up, and you have what's called your Doppler gate, which is right here. Obviously the arrow's pointing at it, but that's your sample gate. And is what you're going to do is you're essentially telling the ultrasound machine that you do not care about anything else that's going on the ultrasound machine other than what's in this little area. And so you're going to take and you're going to place that little area right over an area of interest. And so this is similar to the color Doppler videos earlier. And we're going to rely on Doppler shift to provide an image for us. We are once again over the patient's aorta, and we're going to go ahead and get a sample here. So we're going to place that sampling gate right there over the aorta. And essentially, like I said, we're ignoring everything else that's going on with the ultrasound, and all we've done is left this little tiny area, and all we care about is what's going on there. And we want to see what's happening with flow or those type of things there. And so we are going to get a sample that looks like this. And what it does is at time 0, it gives you a tracing going from left to right of what's happening over time. And we get it in a scale of centimeters per second. So if we look at this, on this aorta, we're getting flows approaching about 75 to 80 up here. It's it gets a little light there, but you can tell it's coming up all the way to the top. And that's how fast that flow is coming across. And so we can see over time, this is definitely an arterial flow, has a nice peak, has a nice rebound, and we're going to do that. So these are positive deflections. So that is, if you watch the Doppler effect or the color Doppler video, you'll understand that this is flow towards the probe, and then this is as it goes away and then comes back. And so you get a little bit of, the flow coming as it comes through the aorta, a high peak flow as you're through systole, and then that little bit of, not contraction, but rebound of the aorta to get you a little bit more here on the back end. And all we're doing is once again, we've ignored all the rest of the image, and we're just over that little sample gap. So all we're doing is seeing what's happening right there at that tiny, tiny spot over time. And we can see that we have placed this over the aorta. We get that nice flow right through there, which is typical of an arterial type flow, especially the aorta at these velocities. So that's just showing you your scale, once again, which I already pointed out, and then the baseline here. And those can be adjusted. Sometimes if you set your scale too low, you will see what's called, it's called aliasing, and it will come around to the other side.
So that's pulse wave Doppler. Next, we're going to look at continuous wave Doppler, and we're going to see how that's different. And the main difference is that when we're doing continuous wave Doppler, we have two parts of the probe that are active. One is transmitting and the other part of the probe is receiving, and we'll see that in the video next.
Different types of color Doppler also exist for use in cardiac and vascular ultrasound. Cardiac ultrasound primarily uses continuous wave Doppler. A continuous wave transducer is designed to be able to have one part of the transducer constantly producing a sound beam and the other part of the transducer constantly receiving the sound waves that are reflected back. Continuous wave transducers can also accurately determine the speed at which blood flows.
So basically what's happening is one part of the transducer transmits that continuous ultrasound, and then the other part, another crystal or a section of crystals, is receiving the echoes, and the machine's detecting the Doppler shift from the original part to the receiving echo. So the sample volume is that region that overlaps the transmit and receive beams, and sometimes it's quite large. So you really have to know your anatomy when you're using this. And usually continuous wave Doppler, we're usually using it in echocardiography, so it doesn't really, it's not imperative that we deeply understand it to be a general sonographer, but just be aware of what the difference is. So comparing them side by side, which I think is important, they are both single beams, but pulse wave Doppler is using one crystal or one little area of your probe, and it's used to measure high velocities, but it's not able to accurately measure very high velocities. In the case where you get aliasing and you can't fix that, most people will then have to rely on continuous wave Doppler. It does have range resolution though. Whereas continuous wave Doppler, it's two parts of the probe, that one is transmitting and one is receiving, but it's continuous, so we don't have aliasing because we don't have to worry about our PRF. So because of that, we're able to measure high velocities accurately, which is why it's used in echocardiography a lot, and we get a lot of range ambiguity. So just again, continuous wave Doppler. It's an accurate measurement of high velocities, but it has poor range resolution, and our pulse wave Doppler has good range resolution, but it's limited on the maximum velocity that it can read. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to retouch on patient exposure. I did already talk about it, but I'm going to touch on it again because I do think it's really important for sonographers to understand this. So when we look at a typical B mode or grayscale mode, whatever you want to call it, because they're both the same thing. You'll notice that when you're looking at vessels, it's black. And so we would say that that is an anechoic area. And that's where our blood is. And that's because, you know, blood, the scattering that we get from blood, it's very weak. In fact, only red blood cells significantly scatter. So when the machine goes into Doppler, it has to do something to compensate for this, you know, weak scattering area that we're interested in. And so what the machine does is it increases the power in Doppler, and it does this by lengthening the transmit pulse duration. So pulse Doppler and continuous wave Doppler, they're using a single line beam, and it's not just a single line beam that's stepping from one side to the other of the screen as it builds up this color image. It's actually stationary. And so, as I said before, that then is increasing, you know, ultrasound energy into a concentrated small area of tissue. And so, you know, as we get any beam that's moving through the body, any ultrasound, you know, wave that's moving through the body, we're distorting cells. And what I mean by that is we're stretching them and contracting them and stretching them and contracting them. And when you do that over and over again with, you know, ultrasound, you create heat in the body. And you need to keep that in mind, which is why we don't expose, you know, little embryos to pulse wave and continuous wave Doppler. And we need to really remember that when we're using Doppler. So we've established that body tissues and blood move in the body. Duh. So this movement can be in any direction to the probe. And that's important to remember. We're sonographers. We put the probe on the body. We need to know our anatomy, and we need to know, you know, where that blood should be moving and what direction that should be moving in. So what we're going to do is just quickly look at how we do that. So we've got in our first example, blood moving towards the probe. So we've got our vessel down here. We've situated our probe, you know, on this angle. And so you can see that as the blood moves up towards the probe, it's going to create what we call a positive shift. Alternatively, here in the middle, we've got a blood vessel. We've got our little arrows showing the blood movement in the direction. But now we've switched our probe from the left side to the right side. So you can see now that the blood is completely moving away from the probe, and that creates a negative shift. It's what we call a negative shift. Now, if we've got the probe 90 degrees to our vessel, and yes, I know that's what we usually want when we're doing B mode, but we don't want that in Doppler, because we are only interested in how the stuff in the vessel is moving either towards or away from the probe. And if we're parallel to it, it's not moving towards and it's not moving away. And so what that happens is in our baseline, you know, in our spectral waveform, we get nothing. We don't get a reading. So this is what we call a no shift. So now let's look at how this would actually appear on our screen. So we've got this little red dot here. You can see that we've got our scale map on the left-hand side. I've circled the positive shift section for you, and you can see that's a positive number. And so what that's telling us is that that blood is moving towards the probe. Now on the bottom, we've got here a little blue circle, which obviously means that the blood is moving away from the probe, and it's a negative number, so it's a negative shift. Now that's our conventional map. We can swap that, and I'll explain that in a minute, but usually most of the time we remember BART. And here's a little photo of BART to help you remember that, and that is for blue is away and red is towards. But as I said, that is our conventional color map. The thing that we do need to remember is that that can be inverted, okay? But the one thing that we're always going to remember is it doesn't matter what color is on top. We can flip it from red to blue. We could flip it to, we could make it pink and green, pink on the top and green on the top. It doesn't matter what color it is. You know, the machine could make any color, but traditionally, conventionally, red is on the top, blue is on the bottom. The most important thing that we need to remember is that whatever's on the top is always going to be representing what's towards the transducer, and whatever's on the bottom is what's going to be away from the transducer. And the reason why people do flip this is because sometimes when they know that they've found an artery and they're looking at an artery, they want to switch it so that an artery is red and a vein is blue. And so that's why we invert that color map at times. And so just to look at a whole screen image, this is what it would typically come up here. This is our B mode in the back. We've got our color overlay on the top, and then we've added in our spectral Doppler, our pulse wave Doppler. And so we've got here our right liver porter. We're in a long mode. I'd say we're either right on the border of the midline, or we're in the intercostal spaces. I'm not sure where we are, but we'd be somewhere up there. And what we can see is that this is red. We can see our positive number up here. We've put in this little range gate. We've got our spectral waveform. We can see our positive numbers on the top, and we can see our negative numbers on the bottom. Okay. Now, as I said, conventionally, when we're looking at our spectral waveform, we will usually see our positive velocity changes, or our positive velocity on the top of our spectral waveform, and we'll see the negative on the bottom. And positive is always going to mean towards, and negative is always going to be away from the transducer. So if for some reason we did flip that, please remember that just because we've got a minus up here doesn't mean, like when we swap our colors, that whatever's on the top is towards the transducer. It's not like that when we're actually looking at the velocity. The plus sign always means towards, and the minus sign always means away, no matter whether it's on the top or the bottom. So just in case that's a little bit confusing, we're going to look at a couple of examples. So we've got our velocity on the side. We can see this one's 200 plus and minus. So here are our positive numbers. This means towards the probe, and this is away from the probe. And in our second example, we've got our positive numbers on the top and our negative numbers on the bottom. So this is towards the probe, and this is away from the probe. But here you can see that we've got negative numbers on the top and we've got positive numbers on the bottom. So in this example, this blood is moving away from the probe, and this one is moving towards the probe. Hope that makes it a bit more clear. Okay, so next we're going to talk about Doppler shift and what it depends on. And what I mean by that is what part of this equation can we change? What part of this equation, if we change it, is going to affect the Doppler shift? So when I first looked at this equation, I was really overwhelmed because I don't have a physics background, and I hate maths. So I thought, well, I found a video that really broke it up, and I want to take that a little step further and explain it slowly. So let's look at Doppler shift again. Doppler shift is the frequency changes as an object is moving either towards or away from an observer. And the observer in the case of sonography is the probe. So let's look at the next number, 2. 2 is the round path of our ultrasound signal. So it comes out of the probe, it goes down to the moving blood or the moving tissue, it comes back to the probe. That is a constant number. We can't change that. That signal has to go down and it has to come back up. So let's leave that alone. Can't change it. Speed is the velocity of blood, and it's often V in our equation. And so when I think about speed, I try to make an image in my head, and I found that this really helped. And so I pictured an image, a healthy vessel and how that moves through. And then I put stenosis in it. And because it's got, stenosis in it now, it's got less room to move. So it's going to move faster through that vessel. And so obviously that's going to affect the Doppler shift. You know, you could have a little tight valve in there and that blood's got to go through that tight valve. And so obviously that's going to speed the blood up. If you speed the blood up, you're going to get a higher Doppler shift. So that's the way I like to think about velocity and how it's, you know, in this equation. So let's look at frequency. Frequency of what? Well, when we're talking about frequency, we're talking about frequency of the probe. So I think what's important to remember here with the machine is that a higher frequency gives you more of a Doppler shift. So if you want to reduce the Doppler shift, maybe because you've got aliasing, you're going to have to switch to a lower frequency probe. And if you don't have the option of, you know, switching to another probe, then maybe you can lower the operator frequency on the probe you're using through the machine. So I think keep that in mind. Again, if you want to change the frequency, because a higher frequency is going to give you more of a Doppler shift, lower the frequency. Let's look at cosine. So cosine, this is the cosine of the angle of inclination. So let's look at an example. If you've got the angle is 90 degrees, then we know that the cosine is 0 because we've done that in our basic physics. And if you don't know that, you'll have to go back and study it. So there's no Doppler shift because we don't have, at 90 degrees, we don't have blood moving towards the probe or away from the probe. So if the cosine is 0, you know, then there's no shift. Nothing's happening. It's not moving towards or away from the probe. Let's look at another example. So let's say your cosine is 1 because you're 0 or 180 degrees. Then you're going to see the highest degree of Doppler shift. So keep in mind that your angle is really going to affect your Doppler shift. And of course, we've got tissue propagation, which is last. And our tissue propagation is the speed of sound as it moves through tissue. And that's also a constant number. We can't change that because it's set into the machine. And it's 1,540 meters per second. Okay, so now let's go back through this equation again and see what we actually can change. So can we change 2? It has to go down, it has to go back. As I already mentioned, we can't change that. Can we change speed? Well, we can't as sonographers change the velocity of blood. The patient can change the velocity of their own blood, you know, but that's not anything that we could change. You know, with time, the patient can change that, you know, through altering their health, but we can't actually change that when they're sitting there in front of us. Can we change the frequency? Yes, of course we can change the frequency. We can lower it, we can make it higher, and as I said before, you know, if it's, you know, a high frequency gives you more of a Doppler shift, so if it's too high and you've got aliasing, lower your frequency. Can we change the angle at which we set? Yes, we can change the angle. So you can see how speed and cosine, the cosine of the angle of inclination, you can see how we can manipulate those. We can't manipulate 2, we can't manipulate speed, we can't manipulate tissue propagation. So the only 2 things that we really can change, you know, in the role of the Doppler shifts in this equation is speed and frequency. So you can see how they relate. And remember that the Doppler angle is the angle between the ultrasound beam and the direction of blood flow. So we've looked at that equation, and now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can change this equation around to our advantage. So when we want the blood velocity values to be measured from the Doppler signal, and we're going to see how we can do that. So once we have the Doppler angle, and that's why, you know, finding that Doppler angle is really crucial, and getting a good Doppler angle is really important, and we'll see why that is in a minute when we look at errors of when we're putting that Doppler angle in. But what we can do is we can write the above equation and we can change it to look like this. So what we're doing here is we've got our, you know, Doppler shift, we've got our 2, which is our constant, we've got the frequency, we now know the angle because we've set it into the machine, we know what, you know, the tissue propagation speed is, which is c, and we don't know what velocity is. But we can figure out what the frequency shift is, because the machine can measure that by measuring the difference between the signal that it sent out originally and the frequency that it was, and then the signal that it received back from the echo of that little tiny gate. So now the quantity in the square brackets, it's constant because we know what all of these numbers are going to be. So what we can do is we can then rearrange the equation to allow the machine to calculate the blood velocity from the Doppler shift. So we're going to move that Doppler shift over to here, and it's going to look something like this. So now we've got velocity over here. Because we've shifted these two and we've swapped these around, we're going to switch this up here. And that's mass, and I hate it, and I honestly don't really understand how this equation changes and why it changes like this, but I've memorized the equation. And most physics, you know, tests for sonography, they'll give you the equations that you need at the start of the test, and if they don't, well, you just have to memorize it. But what we can do from this is we can now, you know, measure the blood velocity. As long as we know what this is here, and as long as we can, the machine can calculate that Doppler shift for us, we can then rearrange it to figure out the velocity. But it is important, you know, to understand that if the user doesn't apply the angle correction, the machine's going to just assume that the Doppler angle is 0 degrees, and it's going to calculate the blood velocity based on that assumption. So you need to be really careful that you set that Doppler angle correctly. So what we're going to look at now is our Doppler angles. And I did mention in the previous slide that it's really important that we get that Doppler angle correct. And that's because that Doppler angle is really going to play a big part in our measurement accuracy. You know, the measurement of blood velocity from the Doppler spectral display, it can never be completely accurate. And there's reasons for that. And so some of those reasons are that, you know, we never really know the exact direction of flow. And then also where we place our angle correction, where we put the measurement calipers on the spectral display, that's completely subjective. And obviously, you know, each sonographer, when they look at a vessel, what they think is parallel to the wall it can vary. And as much as we try and get that consistent, we're never going to get it completely consistent because each person's eye is different. And then there's something else called intrinsic spectral broadening, and that's a Doppler artifact that can be discussed in another lecture. But just keep in mind that there are reasons of why that, you know, Doppler angle is never completely accurate. So the main thing I guess that we're going to remember is that Doppler angles greater than 60 degrees, they shouldn't be used when blood velocity values are being measured from the Doppler signal. So basically, if the Doppler angle is greater than 60, we're not going to use it. And the reason for that is because there are errors. So an error of a few degrees when we're, you know, trying to get our Doppler angle, it doesn't make a massive difference to the calculation of blood velocity. And we can see that in the table below when we're looking at a 1 degree deviation. So what that means is that we've looked at the vessel, we've done our angle correction, but we're off by 1 degree. And you can see that, you know, down here we've got our angles. So let's look at, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. The error that we're off in that angle, it's not too much. But once we get past 60, you can see how sharp that error margin, goes up. And so you need to keep that in mind. So this is a 1 degree deviation off the correct angle. Let's look at what happens when we have a 5 degree deviation. So here we've got, our 60 degree angle. We're off by, 5 degrees. So we are going to get a 15% error in the blood velocity. So when the angle of 60 is a 5 degree error in determining the Doppler angle, it causes a 15% error in the blood velocity. So that's why we have the general rule that angles larger than 60 degrees, they're associated with unacceptable errors, and they just can't be used when we're getting the velocity values from the Doppler signal.
First, the Doppler sample volume gate should be positioned in the center of the lumen, or in the area of highest velocity. Next, adjust the sample volume. The sample volume is the area of flow that will be represented in the waveform. The sample volume size should be set to approximately 1/3 of the vessel diameter. Another user configurable parameter is the angle correct setting, or AC. The AC corresponds with this bar. The purpose of this setting is to provide a correction factor in order to achieve the correct inclination angle. The goal is to align the AC bar with the direction of flow. The AC value should be in the range of 0 to 60 degrees.
Okay, so the optimal degree that we set it at, usually is 60 degrees. And that's because angles close to 60 degrees are just more common. And so, it is really important to make measurements with care and to follow your protocols really closely. But just remember that an angle of 90 degrees is going to give you no signal. And it's going to be really less accurate velocity once you get an angle greater than 60. So you really want something between, your 0 and 60 degrees, and anything above 60 is really not acceptable.
All right, so let's dive right into spectral Doppler. So spectral Doppler provides a graphical representation to plot the velocity of blood on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. And blood flow towards the probe is going to be represented by a positive deflection above the baseline, whereas blood flow away from the probe is going to be a negative deflection below the baseline.
Now, I know we've looked at Doppler spectral display already, but I just want to make note that the velocity is calculated by the machine from the Doppler shift, and that's measured in centimeters per second or meters per second. But I've also introduced this here again because I want you to take note of the NYQUIST limit, and that was the little green writing just above the velocity scale. Because next we're going to look at the PRF, which is the pulse repetition frequency. And we're going to see how the NYQUIST limit and the velocity scale are affected by the PRF. So let's watch a video about that next.
As we mentioned before, the obligatory pause to listen is a key feature of pulsed wave Doppler. Because of this pause, PW is limited by what we call a pulse repetition frequency, or PRF. The PRF is defined as the cycle of emitting a sound wave into tissues and then pausing before receiving the returning echo. PRF is influenced by both the intrinsic characteristics of the ultrasound transducer as well as by the depth of the structures being interrogated. Intuitively, we can understand that it takes longer for ultrasound waves to travel to and from deeper structures compared to more superficial ones. The presence of the PRF leads to what we term the NYQUIST limit, which is essentially the upper limit of blood velocity that can be detected using pulsed wave Doppler. And the NYQUIST limit by definition is half of the PRF. And this is because in order for the transducer to be able to accurately interpret the reflected ultrasound waves, it must be able to sample a wave at least twice per wavelength. So this is most easily demonstrated graphically as we see here. In panels A and B, we can see that each wavelength is sampled at least twice, so these would be interpretable by PW. The blue wave, which is the true ultrasound wave, and the red wave, which is the machine interpretation, are aligned. And in contrast, in the bottom panel C and D, the wavelengths are sampled less than twice per wavelength. That is, the frequency of the wavelength is too high to allow them to be accurately interpreted by PW. So here the red wave, which is the machine interpretation, isn't accurate because the true ultrasound wave, in blue, isn't sampled frequently enough. The velocity of blood that generates these reflected sound waves therefore exceeded the NYQUIST limit for these bottom panels.
Okay, so what we can remember from this is when you look at your spectral display, you'll have your velocity on the side, and whatever that limit is, say you've got it set at 100, once the blood velocity goes over that, you've exceeded your NYQUIST limit. So the maximum Doppler shift that can be detected unambiguously is basically equal to 1/2 of the Doppler PRF. So just remember that when you're looking at your frequency shift, your PRF divided by 2 is your maximum Doppler shift that can be detected. Okay?
Okay, a second concept to understand is the scale setting, which has to do with the sampling rate, but think of the scale for Doppler as the range of velocities that are shown. So for spectral Doppler, the scale is the y-axis, and we want it set up so that most of the graph visualizes the waveform. So if the scale is too big or too high, then the waveform in comparison is going to look obviously very small. And if the scale is too low or too small, then we can get flow that's literally off the charts or goes above what we're trying to look at or goes above the scale. And that's what causes what we call aliasing or wraparound artifact. So let's take a look at what that would look like. And so what is aliasing? I know this slide is busy, but we'll go through each of them in turn. So if the velocities are too high for the scale, the velocities that are off the chart are going to wrap around and be shown as negative. But if you look at this example here, we have a vessel here that is interrogated with color Doppler, and there's a spectral Doppler waveform here. And quite literally, this arterial flow is so high that it's off the scale and it's wrapping around to the negative side here, and it's being displayed in the negative portion here. And if you look at the color, this is all flow that's coming towards the probe, but you see all these little areas that are blue. And those little areas that are blue represent aliasing or wraparound. So that's not actually little areas of flow away from the probe, it's just aliasing artifact or artifact due to the scale being too low. So to conceptualize this, the most common example that people give is the example of taking a video recording of a wheel on a car, and it explains why a wheel on a car is obviously going forward when the car is moving forward, but on video camera sometimes it looks like the wheel is going backwards. And so if we look at this top row here, which is labeled real, so this is what the wheel is actually doing, you can see that the wheel is kind of moving in a clockwise direction. So this marker here is pointing to the left, then up, then to the right, then down. So it's rolling kind of in a clockwise direction. But when we sample it with a video camera, which is essentially sampling intermittently, if we just look at what we're sampling, so we sample here, then here, then here, if we didn't know what was really happening and we just saw the sampled areas, if we look at the markers, we see that it's pointing left, then it's pointing down, then it's pointing right, and despite the fact that we know the wheel is rotating clockwise, it looks like it's rotating counterclockwise. So it's all just about sampling frequency, and that's what this example illustrates. And remember, I mentioned earlier briefly that the scale is essentially a product of sampling rate. And so if the blood flow is too high, namely if the frequency shift is more than half of the pulse repetition frequency, the Doppler shift is more than half of the PRF or pulse repetition frequency, that's when you get aliasing. But don't worry about that. The takeaway is the basic principle of aliasing. What is it and what does it look like on the images?
Okay, so what we really need to remember here is when that Doppler shift exceeds the Nyquist limit, which is usually your scale that's set on the side, you're going to get frequency aliasing. I guess then the next thing we need to think about is, what can we do to our machine? What can we alter to fix that? And that's what we're going to look at next. So I guess when we talk about fixing aliasing, I think it's easy to look at this little diagram that I've got in the corner because it's really simple. Basically, you can see here that you've got your Nyquist limit in the green. And obviously, that limit is where our velocity scale ends are. So if you want to, if you're getting wraparound because you've exceeded that limit, then all you have to do is increase your velocity scale. Pretty simple. But keep in mind that there is a maximum of what your machine's going to be able to give you. So spectral Doppler has a limit on what velocities it can record. The other thing you can do is you can shift the baseline. So that's this line here. You can see in the yellow on the right hand side, it's got baseline. So shifting the baseline is going to, allow the machine to make the image look nice. But you've got to keep in mind that you've pretty much maxed out your spectral Doppler, your velocity limit of what your spectral Doppler can record. So yes, you can move the baseline down, you can make it look pretty, but you've still maxed out everything. The other thing you can do is reduce the ultrasound frequency, and we talked about that when we looked at the equation. And remember I said that, if you're getting aliasing, you can reduce your frequency by changing your probe, or you can change the settings on your machine to reduce the frequency on your probe. Because remember, high frequencies result in a higher Doppler shift, and that's basically, what this is over here, because your Doppler shift is directly related to your velocity. So you can change that ultrasound frequency by reducing it. The other thing that you can do is you can find a window that reduces the depth of the sample volume so that PRF can be increased further. Most sonographers have tried to find the best window. If you're aware of your anatomy and where you're putting the probe, we're already trying to find the best window we can with the lowest amount of depth when we're doing Doppler. So usually that option isn't there if the sonographer knows what they're doing. But we're all novices and we're still learning, so keep that in mind. The other thing you can do is you can increase the Doppler angle, but remember that we're not going to go over 60, because once we go over 60 degrees, those error margins are going to result in a big percentage of your velocity measurements. So you have to keep in mind, we just don't go over 60. So you can increase the angle to fix that aliasing, but don't go over 60. And the final option is that we can switch to continuous wave Doppler. Continuous wave Doppler is not affected by the PRF, and so it doesn't have aliasing issues. Depending on what you're looking at and what you're trying to diagnose, you could also use power Doppler because that's angle independent. So that's options depending on what you're looking at. So I guess the overall thing to keep in mind is that slower moving blood cells and objects, you can turn the PRF down. And when you've got faster moving blood cells and objects, you can turn the PRF up. So I guess that is the bulk of the presentation of what I've made, and I hope that has really helped. I do intend on making another presentation about, you know, Doppler artifacts, but we'll see how that goes. So I hope this has helped, and I hope you've enjoyed it.